Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you all for attending AFA's Aircraft Systems panel. My name is Jackie Janning-Lask, Director for the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center, Engineering Directorate, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel. On the panel, I'm joined by Mr. Marc Ayala, the Senior Director of Business Development for Military Avionics and Helicopters at Collins Aerospace. Marc is responsible for global business development activities for cockpit avionics on mobility, fighter, bomber, special operations, and command and control platforms. He's an Air Force veteran with multiple combat deployments. Also on the panel is Mr. Sean Bond, Senior Vice President for Airborne Solutions at Elbit Systems of America. Sean leads the Airborne Solutions team focused on providing products and solutions that instantly transform digital data into actionable decision quality information for presentation to military aviators. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today for today's panel. The main purpose for today's panel is to get those in the aircraft systems community together for a discussion on developments within the field and goals for programs going forward. I'll have each of the panel members present some brief comments. I'm going to go ahead and get started and talk a little bit about systems integrity and the focus of aircraft systems on a weapon system. We can look at true aircraft systems integrity from many lenses. We can look at it from a policy or compliance perspective, airworthiness, operational safety, suitability, and effectiveness. We can look at it from an integration of processes and standards. And then we'll also talk about having an open systems approach, things like FACE standards and MBE. And so our panelists represent development activities spanning weapon systems avionics, embedded computer systems, digital data and information systems for military systems. If you're familiar with Dr. Roper's digital holy trinity, as he calls it, that paradigm suggests that the three imperatives to move forward quickly and with agility are digital engineering, software development, and modular open systems. And when you think about it from that perspective, one of the biggest questions that ABMS is trying to answer, which is the Advanced Battle Management System, is how do we move data at machine speed across the mission space? System level, subsystem level, we could talk satellites to weapon systems to air, land, and sea. And when you look at, we can look at just avionics, for instance, in an aircraft system. But do you ever consider or think about the other systems that need to be integrated, such as a crew system seat? Do we ever think about integrating an escape system? So these are all part and parcel to the integration of weapon systems and this joint aircraft systems initiative that will require a level of systems integrity in order to be more agile and enable the future of things like artificial intelligence. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Marc for some opening comments. Marc?
All right, well, thanks, Jackie, and it's thanks to AFA for extending the invitation. It's a privilege to be part of this panel. A little bit about my background. I actually have an Air Force background. I've served 13 years in actually active duty Air National Guard and Reserve. So I have the trifecta in terms of the total force. And so I bring an operator's perspective to industry. I've been in industry now for 12 years. And so it is, in preparing for this panel, I was asking myself, you know, what has changed in terms of aircraft systems over the last 20 or so years that I've been involved in the Air Force construct. And, you know, I really feel like in the last several years, and Dr. Roper's Holy Trinity is sort of a indicator of this, but, you know, I think we're really approaching an intersection of technology between legacy mechanically based systems and digital engineering and what we would think of as traditional avionics systems. And the fact that everything has a processor now, or seems to, is something that we're going to have to contend with for years to come. And so, you know, as we tend to think about legacy mechanical systems like hydraulics and electrical and the traditional bleed air systems that, you know, are inherent in our legacy aircraft, and contrast that with what 6th generation platforms are going to need in order to be effective in this ABMS construct, or, you know, whatever the future may ultimately hold. That's going to require some fundamental changes for all of us. And, you know, I think about aircraft systems really more as the critical infrastructure that enable all those new capabilities. And so we are going to have to be able to transition into a mode of thinking, not about, you know, pumps and things that we should think about in the traditional sense, but really about data is what it comes down to. There's data that's flowing on and off the aircraft. There's data flowing between aircraft, and there's data flowing within the aircraft. And I think the focus on things of the ABMS type nature require us to consider things that we haven't really considered before, like bandwidth, for example. You know, it's interesting we're in this environment that we are, because I don't know about you, but I never really considered bandwidth in terms of my ability to do my job until this pandemic hit. And thank God our cable provider in our neighborhood came in and installed fiber to the home. I probably wouldn't be able to have this this conversation with you today, but that's part of the critical infrastructure that we need to do our jobs today. And we have to transition our way of thinking into that mindset as we think about the aircraft and the ability to get data on and off of that aircraft, transmit it to the wider network of aircraft in the sky, along with space and ground terminals, and then also deal with the processing of that data within the aircraft and across aircraft. So that's the standpoint that I'm coming to this panel today.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I had a little trouble there with my own bandwidth, so to speak. So you presented 3 really good points, right? The Air Force systems that we have now, the new versus the legacy, certainly an issue we've had for a while, but now getting the data on and off, as you suggest, is part of that issue. And then aircraft systems as a critical infrastructure is indeed what we're doing and what we're looking at as a weapon system. So thanks. Now I'm going to move over to Sean. If Sean can give us some opening comments, please.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. So when I look at the pilot environment and the maintainer environment for the aircraft that we have today, I'm really reminded of a surgeon in an operating room. And if you've ever seen an operating room, it can be a bit overwhelming, all the sounds, the machines, the people surrounding the patient. To me, organized chaos to the untrained eye. But when the surgeon says scalpel, she needs to know that the scalpel is there and ready to be used. No hesitation, no confusion, just the right tool at the right moment. Here at Elbit America, we know that our pilots and operators and maintainers need to do the same, ensure that their tools are ready to be deployed at the moment that they need them. Part of the challenge that we have today is that sometimes we can evolve capability. We cannot evolve capability fast enough to really ensure that our folks have the right tool at the right time against an ever-changing and rapidly evolving threat environment. And it's not just when you're up in the air, it's also, you know, when your tools are down on the ground. So the time of change and the cost of change can be prohibitive. So here at Elbit, we get it. We talk about connecting the dots, and you hear that quite frequently. We're focusing on leveraging our knowledge of the dots, the domain expertise that we have around these different dots, in a way that we can leverage that domain expertise and ensure that the connection of these dots is an enabler for that rapid evolution of capability into the field. digital engineering, modular development, open architecture. These are, this is the framework of how we're going to be able to do that. Because today we have so many information sources coming at a pilot or an operator or maintainer, right? You have sensors, and everything has a sensor today. Everything's smart. You know, it's not just your phones. It's my the lights in my house know when they're on, and they know that they're okay. And so, how do we leverage all those smarts across all these disparate systems, on platform, off platform, to go ahead and fuse together and create an operational picture that can go ahead and enable us to have the right tool at the right time for that pilot. And on top of that, give us a heads up when things aren't going so right. So it's a really, really exciting environment. And I'll just say, you know, I think in the past, in the old days, so to speak, which is still today, I suspect, we would design an analog reality and then create a digital replicant. And where we're evolving today is we're actually designing a digital reality and then creating an analog replicant. And so I think this is a very exciting time for all of us in the industry. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to speak with y'all.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. We already have a question for you, but the first question I'm actually going to go to Marc for, and then we'll get back to you, Sean. So Marc, the question is, everything has a processor now. How will certification affect the fielding of new aircraft systems leveraging the Internet of Things?
Yeah, it's a good one. Processing is becoming an ever increasing problem for us to solve, and I think it's not just us at Collins, it's not just Sean at Elbit, it's everybody, and it's something that we as the Air Force construct really have to get behind. I think the first revelation that I've had with regard to this is the fact that we are really lagging in terms of aircraft systems and avionics behind the commercial computing industry when it comes to the adoption of multi-core processing. We are using it in places, but we do not have the widespread adoption that we've seen in the commercial market, for example, due to that certification. So it's critically important, and it directly relates to the way that we certify safety critical components that may be of a catastrophic nature. If they fail, we can't afford to have things not work and then cause an airplane to go down. So when we think about how multi-core processing is involved in whatever that process is, we have to take that construct seriously. And so we have to start going through our processes and making sure that we're working that into requirements so that we certify multi-core processing the same way that we have traditional processors. And there's really an important distinction here. It's not enough to say we need to have more multi-core processing, we need to certify it. We need to certify it in the right way. So you can take the simple route and you can say, okay, I have a multi-core processor, I'm going to certify it, and I'm only going to use one core of the 4 or 8 cores or however many it has. Well, that's really not getting you anything. That's just filling an old gap with something new. But in order to make that next generational leap in capability, we're going to have to be able to utilize all those cores and do it in a way that we feel comfortable enough within our safety certification standards in order to use on a regular basis. And so being able to certify all available cores on whatever multi-core processor we're using is going to be critical going forward.
Okay, great. So we talk about from a system of systems, and we even get down to the board level, the chip level, right? So we need that integrity at every level. So thanks for that question. The next question, I'm going to move over to Sean. What is really HPC other than a buzzword? We have machine to machine, but no real-time data. So it seems contradictory in a way. How can you and Mr. Wirt and stakeholders encourage actionable data from saturation without building another COP? With technology and weapon systems outpacing the warfighter, how do you envision bringing that gap without vendor lockdown?
Boy, there is a lot to unpack in that question. And it's a great question. It's a really it's a challenge for all of us. So the key here is I'll say up until now, often the integration of all of the information that's coming in to an operator is being done in that person's head, and they are, sometimes you could easily imagine getting overloaded by just how much is coming in and how to decide which one to pay attention to. There's certain phrases I've heard in the past regarding the audible signals that are yelling at a pilot, let's say, when something's not going quite right. And so the real challenge for us is how do we ensure that processing that we're talking about earlier is done in a way that is rapid, fast, and highlights only the things that the operator needs to know. And so what comes into that? How do we decipher as we're doing the vAWS tactical picture, let's say, for example, and all the apps that follow? How do we ensure that we're not just overwhelming a pilot? This is where AI starts to come into play, artificial intelligence, neural networks, basically self-learning algorithms to constantly be surveilling the environment around a pilot and letting him or her know what she needs to know and prioritizing it in such a way that it's not overwhelming. And so that ideally that pilot can focus on the tactics that they need to deliver to complete the mission and not focusing on, I'll say, flying the aircraft. And no offense to the pilots out there. We love flying aircraft to be certain, but it's a great question. There's a lot of work to be done there. And, we're working on programs today to go ahead and try to create that fusion in such a way that it's not overwhelming. Anything can be a buzzword. The question is more, what are we going to do about it? And how do we create it into something that's reality? So maybe didn't hit the mark on that, but it's a great question. There's a lot of work to be done by teams like us at Elbit America and Marc's team at Collins. Marc, I'm sort of curious, if you have the answer to this, text it to me, because this is a really tough one, I'd say.
No, I think you're spot on. I think you did a pretty good job.
So yeah, that was a great question. And I'm going to ask folks, we have some folks commenting in chat and we have some under Q&A. And so we will be following the Q&A questions. But for the other panelists, I encourage you to also look at the chat. But we really need to keep it in one spot. So we will be taking questions via the Q&A area. So next question. Will we see future aircraft system solutions being developed within platform silos, or will we see common solutions being applied across different aircraft types? Who would like to take that one?
I can jump in on that one. I think it's kind of a loaded question, because I think the answer is somewhat obvious. It has to be developed across platforms as much as possible, with the understanding that there are certain things that are not going to work for every aircraft, just due to size, weight, and power and things like that. A mission computer, for example, that might be developed for a tanker or mobility aircraft, not necessarily a fit in a fighter. You have to compensate for things like that. But outside of that, we really have to grow our understanding, or really kind of unlearn what we've learned with respect to how we field LRUs. We think about things in line replaceable units and the wires that connect them, but really we're entering a construct now where we have to start thinking at the card level, and even beyond the card down to the individual processor level, let's say. And it's really the ability to swap out those components that's going to give us that speed of relevance that Dr. Roper has talked about in the past, because we're not going to be able to develop siloed applications and systems through the traditional Air Force acquisition cycle that takes 3 or 4 years to get something developed and fielded. By the time that happens, the processing speed and the AI algorithms, in terms of their output, they've doubled or perhaps tripled in the time that we've developed the system. And so the old acquisition cycle is going to yield us a product that's outdated from the moment we field it. So we have to get better at that, and we have to be able to do it, number one, at a smaller component level, by inserting and taking out old obsolete cards and putting in new relevant ones, and then also being able to field containerized software that presents itself in an application type environment where you can sort of use an app store, to borrow a term, where you can rapidly do things like that. And all that has to be done within an open system environment. So we can't, to the question earlier that implied a vendor lock, we can't do it in such a way where only one company or team of companies has access to be able to support that aircraft in the future, because things are changing too rapidly. We have to be more agile in that sense.
Hey, Sean, did you have any comments on that?
It's just it's perfect. The challenge that may exist around this question is going to be around the acquisition. Will acquisition happen in silos by platform, or will we have a sort of a cross-functional slice, if you will, across different platforms? But I completely agree with Mark. That's where we need to get to, clearly on emerging platforms, but also now for the legacy platforms, right? And so how do we reach back into the legacy fleet? I think will be a real cool challenge for all of us to try to figure out together.
Okay, great. So I'm going to take this in one direction, and then we're going to come back and take it in another direction. So we're going to go to the past, and then we're going to go to the future. So with that question on open architecture and making common solutions applied across different aircraft types, we're doing that on the emerging aircraft platforms. What are the opportunities to deploy these same capabilities across legacy fleets? And Sean, since you're up on the screen, we'll let you take that one first.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. I'm getting all the easy ones here. So let's see. This is where I think that the bigger challenge will be on the legacy fleets of aircraft types. They were designed in a time where I won't say point designs, but the form factors are going to be different. Anytime you have to touch the OFP on an aircraft, that's a huge change, costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time. So as we're thinking about how do we take what we're developing for this next generation of digital aircraft, how do we reach back into those legacy platforms? I think it's going to be challenging, but it's not impossible. And how do we do it in such a way that, once again, can we do these sort of changes and not touch the OFP? Can we make these changes in a way that doesn't affect the form factors, the physical dimensions, if you will? I think it can be done. Moore's law. Mark was talking about the rapid change of capability. The way I see it, we have no choice but to ensure that those legacy fleets are fully armed with the latest in capabilities that are being developed right now for the next generation of weapon systems.
So Sean, you called this an easy question, but Mark actually brought it out in his opening remarks about the changes in Air Force systems from legacy versus our state-of-the-art weapon systems now. So I'm going to shift this one over to Mark now and see what his impression is. And then I'm going to ask you a more futuristic question.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I agree with Sean, that the legacy aircraft are going to be more challenging in this regard than the new platforms. And this really gets back to the bandwidth idea that I was talking about earlier. In order for legacy aircraft to be relevant, not only are their systems going to have to be upgraded in the manner I just described in the last question, but they're also going to have to be upgraded in terms of that critical infrastructure that is allowing that data to get on and off the aircraft. And so this is where concepts and ideas like a digital backbone come into play, which is a term that gets thrown around a little bit and has different meanings in different places depending on what context we're using it in. But in the context I'm using it in here, I'm talking about the system of wires and the network that exists on the aircraft that handles the data flow in one form or another. There are some legacy platforms out there that have gone through different upgrade cycles in the past years and have migrated to an Ethernet type network structure. And that's okay for today. But I think in the very near future, Sean brought up Moore's law and the idea that processing speed doubles every 18 to 24 months, I think it is. There's actually an interesting study from Stanford that contrasts that against AI and asks, is that still relevant? And the study found that AI is actually doubling in terms of output every 3 to 4 months. So if you take a given processor's life cycle of 18 to 24 months, that means that the AI output of that processor is going to go through an exponential growth just within the life of that processor. And so we're very quickly going to outpace Ethernet even as a network protocol that we're going to be able to depend on. And so we have to move beyond that to the next steps. We're looking at things like time-sensitive networking and ring networks and things that will help us with redundancy. There's a lot of our legacy aircraft out there. We have a capability for something, and we carry 2 of them for redundancy purposes. So if one of them fails or takes a bullet or whatever the case may be and no longer functions, we have the second one to act as a backup. Well, if we're able to transition to some of these new capabilities where we have a ring network that will allow that data flow to flow in either direction, for example, or we have the ability to swap out individual cards, and we have the ability to move processing around, which is part of the the DevSecOps and software containerization idea. That will eliminate the need to have redundant systems for every capability that we have on the aircraft. So as those things mature, we have to be able to inject those into legacy aircraft. And in order to do that, we have to have the infrastructure in terms of that digital backbone, if you will, in order to make that work.
Great answer. And it plays right into my next questions. Now we're going to talk about the AI part of it. So how will artificial intelligence affect the future of aircraft systems? And is the horizon of implementation in this decade or beyond 2030? And I'm going to have you take that one first, and then I'm going to shift over to Sean. Thanks.
Yeah, it's another flavor of the same thing. And multi-core processing, the ability to have a critical infrastructure in terms of a digital backbone will be critical. We've already talked about that. The DevSecOps and software containerization are an aspect of that, but really it's something that we have to do in parallel for the time being, because I do agree that we are several years away from that being really relevant in terms of something that we can field and make use of. I think we've had some early prototyping successes on different platforms and different constructs that we can point to, and we can feel confident or more confident that we're moving in the right direction. But we do have a little bit of time, but as I mentioned, we're probably 1 to 2 processor cycles away from being completely overwhelmed. And so this is something that we have to be serious about, not only in terms of our priority, but in terms of what we put our money behind. And I mean that in terms of the total Air Force construct, not just the DoD federal budget, but also what we in industry decide we're going to invest in. So we are certainly making that shift within Collins. I'm certain that Sean and his folks are making that shift within Elbit, and really the rest of the industry is following suit.
Okay, Sean, any thoughts on that? 2030 or within the next decade?
I think we're going to start seeing, and you could argue are already starting to see, the implementation of AI and machine learning today. And it's not just in terms of an aircraft up in the air, but actually an aircraft on the ground. Having your systems raise their hand and saying, I'm here and I'm okay, so that we can focus our attention on preemptive actions, if you will, and in keeping these assets flying. So I think we're starting to see it today. I think 2030 and beyond, my imagination isn't big enough, because I'll tell you, we often get very surprised by disruptive innovations that come in. And so and we're seeing it everywhere. You know, I see Teslas seemingly self-driving all around town here in San Antonio. So I think we're going to see it rapidly start to emerge this year. You may see it once again more on the ground than up in the air, but I think it's happening now, and I think we need to be open and ready for it.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a question. We had two questions. I'm going to take the first one. I'm going to give it a shot. That question is, commitment has to meet investment and bridge the DevSecOps training and operations. Why is there a lack of investment in AFAMS/training? So I can tell you from a modeling and simulation perspective and a digital vantage point that we have, at least in Air Force Material Command, is we are moving quickly digital. We have an Air Force Material Command digital campaign that is moving quickly in terms of open systems architecture, the training that's needed, the culture change. And so we are rising to the challenge in terms of investment, and that's definitely something that we need in order to keep moving forward with upskilling our workforce. So that's one answer to that question. Anybody else have any comments on that? The next question. I like open architecture, modular systems, etc., for fleet-wide use, but how does one protect against a cyber threat that might take down an entire capability?
So I'm
Sean,
dying to weigh in on this.
Mark? Okay, all right, let's go.
So this is kind of an interesting angle, and maybe not the answer that whoever asked the question might have intended, but this really goes back to multi-core processing and the idea of having those systems certified via our normal certification standards, whether they be commercial-based or military-based or some sort of hybrid. And if you think about it, if you have a multi-core processor that has 4 or 8 cores, whatever the case may be, in order to certify that system to work, or an application that's running on one of those processors, inherent in that certification is an understanding and awareness by the system to be able to recognize what's running and what's not running on the other cores. And so by focusing on certification, we're going to get 50% of the way there to cybersecurity just by being aware of what's running on the other cores. And in the old days, we used to be able to live comfortably with a single core, and the only thing the processor was running was the application. And we had the ability to partition it to some extent, but it was much simpler to understand what was happening within the scope of one processor. So as we grow into processors with multiple cores, we have to be able to be aware simultaneously of what we're doing within the application that we're running, as well as the applications that are running in the background, perhaps on a different core, which is much more complex. And that's why that certification piece is such a difficult problem to solve. And so we have to get after both of those if we're going to make any cybersecurity attempt to block efforts of intrusion and things like that through normal means.
Thank you. Sean, any thoughts on that one?
I think Mark hit it right on, and the whole cybersecurity threat is real. It's moving fast. Cyber is a big deal down here in San Antonio, and most of my friends are in that space. My son's in uniform in the Air Force at Lackland right now, working in this space, or so I'm told. But yeah, this is something that we can figure out, and I think Mark is exactly right. This is how we can address that potential vulnerability of taking out an entire fleet. But I think the architectures that we're discussing, I believe are going to keep us safe in that regard. Absolutely right.
Can you address how cloud computing impacts that in terms of certification? What are the opportunities that we may have?
It's a good question. I see cloud computing. There's different clouds, right? So I guess it depends on whose cloud. I think in some ways the clouds, the mesh networks and such that will enable us to go ahead and pull all this information on platform, off platform, tactical info and such. That's what we're working on today. And so I think the efforts are underway in that regard. I think it's quite frankly, it's an enabler. So you can have different assets talking to each other securely. And then if you're in denied environments, the ability to self-form clouds. I think there's a lot there, and I think the efforts are actually underway. I won't talk too much further about it, but I think we're in a good position. We're heading the right direction when it comes to the cloud or the various clouds that we'll create to serve a mission.
Okay, good. Mark, I'm going to send this question over to you. It's very similar to a follow-up. Bandwidth, which you were talking about earlier, has always been a challenge. Similarly, which the Navy has always dealt with, not much different platform to platform, regardless of air to air or sea to sea. I can envision node hopping solutions between proximity, for lack of better words, that are air to air agnostic to platform. For example, F-35 mesh with an MQ-9 and then moving out of that MQ-9 regional space hopping to another. How can mesh tech really improve system of system ecosystem integrated environments also and stay secure?
Yeah, it's a great point. And it is the future, and it's something that we're going to have to all grasp here, whether we want to or not. And I think it kind of ties in with the last question as well, because let's take the ABMS construct, right? That's really our first practical application in a combat scenario of cloud computing, and the X1 concept, platform one, cloud one, all the different elements of it. I think those are relevant models that we can use. But what we need is standardization and alignment around that being a solution. Because what we in industry can't afford to do is go invest in every possible iteration of cloud computing and expect them to work. We really need the Air Force to get behind. If it is going to be the ABMS construct, that's going to be what we use. And then we can use that as the basis of to go make that a reality. With regard to the bandwidth question and the use of mesh networks, I think one of the critical things to understand and grasp about this is that the node hopping concept has to be something that happens in the background. And what I mean by that is the pilot, if there is a pilot, obviously in an MQ-9 you wouldn't have that, but if there is a pilot, you're not aware of what the node is doing or not doing. And that brings the cybersecurity aspect into it again. But in reality, because of the speed of the exchange of data, there's not going to be time to allow the pilot in the loop. If we have a piece of data that bounces from MQ-9 to F-35 to KC-135 tanker to satellite to ground, for example, that has to happen fast enough for that information to get back to the place where a decision can be made with the data, and then return that through that system of nodes back to the point of origination for some sort of decision or action. And so I don't think this is something that I really came to terms with and grasped myself until very recently, that the nodes are going to have to be autonomous or semi-autonomous themselves. They're going to have to be enabled by the critical infrastructure on the aircraft and then allowed to communicate freely. Now that the second half of the question was in regard to how do you do that in a threat scenario and still make it secure. There's obviously going to have to be some sort of emission control standard that's going to be associated with the nodes. So the same way that you would turn off your RF emitting components as you get closer and closer to the threat, you would have some sort of a switch that would shut all that off if you were really in a scenario where you didn't want the traffic to give you away. So I think that's going to have to be an aspect of it as well. It's going to have to make itself into the requirements for these systems. And then obviously the cybersecurity piece, as I mentioned before, that will be sort of the ongoing threat that we constantly encounter in the background. And so doing it within the construct that we've been talking about here in the panel will be an important piece of that.
Thank you. So to follow up with that from a cybersecurity perspective, is there any effort to develop and use artificial intelligence and machine learning for cybersecurity system tasks? Mark?
That is a good one. I would say that there is. We probably can't talk about them in this forum. The challenge there will be, you know, the cybersecurity threat. You have to recognize that the bad actors that are out there trying to break into our systems, they're already using it, right? I mean, nothing is very effective that doesn't already use some sort of an AI algorithm to try and defeat whatever security that we've set up. And so it's only natural that our cybersecurity has to evolve at the same pace. And so we're not going to be able to keep up with an AI algorithm with manual coding, right? I mean, we can't. We're going to have to automate that process or semi-automate it and build in some sort of, you know, system of checks and balances in order to be able to do that. So yeah, it's very relevant, and I think it has to be a part of the construct going forward.
Yeah, I have to agree. The AI attacks that are already underway move at the speed of light. And so really the only way that you can play the spy versus spy game, if you will, is to similarly have your defense on an AI type of framework. And beyond that, I'll just say no comment.
Okay, great. So I have a question in terms of, this is about Air Force, air systems, but we also have the Space Force. And I can, you know, my last job was within Air Force Research Lab, and we talked about one of General Pringle's goal is one lab, two services. And so a lot of the research that we are doing is for the Air Force and the Space Force. Can you comment on some of perhaps cutting edge technologies in either Air Force systems or space systems that you think can be either applied, or we have some excellent understanding or foundational processes that can help us in either air or space?
I'll jump in first. Yeah, there's a lot going on and disruptive. And, you know, a lot of my focus, if I go back to the surgeon in that operating room, a lot of our focus here at Elbit America is how do we present them with news that they can use, if you will. And so really, if you think of John Boyd's OODA loop, right? Observe, orient, decide, act. In his OODA loop, he would always say that it's the orient, which is the hardest of the four pieces of the puzzle. And so that orient, in sort of the way I look at things, it's around that. How do you take all these various sources, sensor data, platform data, tactical data, formation data, UAVs and other, you know, how do you take all this from space? How do you take all of this on a set of processors that are going to be sitting on an airplane and figure out how do you fuse it all together and create this fused tactical picture that feeds into the apps, and there's a lot of them, that creates that picture for the pilot in a way that he or she can actually like sort of understand it. I'm not trying to say it's not not overloading them. It's one of the questions earlier. And so the human machine interface piece, and that's where I'm getting to, is critical in enabling that to occur and coming up with human machine interfaces that are safe and affordable and rapidly scalable, modular. That to me that's where the next leap is, because Mark inferred earlier, you know, sometimes we're going to have some of these aircraft, and it's happening today, there's actually not a pilot sitting in the cockpit, right? So we have to create that sense of experience for someone who may be hundreds or thousands of miles away from that platform. And so to me, it's that fusion piece. And we have a great program right now called Aviation Mission Common Server, which is around that sort of fusion bit. And we do a lot of the human machine interface. In fact, you know, us and Collins have, I think, quite frankly, the best helmets in the industry, but, you know, I'm bragging a bit. But that to me is going to be the key. And AI filters through all of this to create that fused tactical view of what's going on around them. So that's my view. A little advertising there for our HMDs. But Marc, over to you.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree on the helmet solutions. And with regard to space, it's interesting because as I think about, you know, space is evolving at a pretty rapid pace as well. And I think for a long time we thought about fleets of space vehicles and satellites the same way that we did aircraft, and I think that was probably a flawed way of thinking about it. You know, we've come a long way since the days of Apollo, and you know, in terms of what's happening now, you know, the obvious thing with space is that you talk about size and weight constrained environments, the space is the ultimate, right? I mean, you can't just take aircraft type systems and put them in a space vehicle and expect to be able to launch it and afford that type of thing on a regular basis. So as I think about space, I'm drawn more to the satellite constellations that are becoming more and more prevalent, especially the low Earth orbit constellations. You know, we've got things up there now like Starlink and Iridium, which has been around for a little bit longer. You know, and connectivity is really the great force multiplier of space, because you're never not underneath it. So no matter where in the globe you are, there can be a satellite overhead, and probably is. So being able to provide our forces that are flying through the air and on the ground, that connectivity, no matter where they are, that's a huge enabler for conflicts of the future. And, you know, we're doing some exciting things with regard to, you know, just simple SATCOM boxes that are going to be able to communicate with those satellite constellations. So that's going to be a huge thing going forward. And obviously being able to rapidly switch between communication waveforms. When you're talking about SATCOM, you're going to have to be able to seamlessly use and perhaps simultaneously use different satellite communication providers, as well as different secure waveforms on and off of the same aircraft, perhaps on and off of the same box. So in terms of, you know, what's happening there, a lot of these same concepts that we're talking about, in terms, especially open systems, making their way into our communication links as well. So you know, one of our other Collins businesses in mission systems has some exciting, pretty exciting new tech in terms of open system communication platforms where they can easily swap out comm. And, you know, perhaps in the future, we might be preparing for a given mission or a given operation and realize that, oh, for this particular mission, we're going to need these comm modules, and we're just going to go take those cards out and put the right ones in. And being able to do that on a pre-mission briefing, for example, and go out to maintenance and make that change. That's something I never, that would have totally blown my mind, you know, 20 years ago when I was flying around. So, and that's all enabled by space. So that's the exciting part from my perspective.
That also brings to mind the Matrix, which Dr. Roper often uses, and as an example of what the future is going to look like. So we do have time for one or two more questions. The question that came in, I know this forum is focused on aircraft systems, but this question it's interesting in terms of how we're going to play in a mission scenario that crosses boundaries. So the Air Force is purple in so many ways, but I fear that the Joint Staff has to be integrated through persistent warfighter working groups, because technology should be the byproduct of .MLPF, which is driven from COCOM demand signals. How will you create a tacit or formal strategy to work as one to align with all the combatant commands? as talk is talk unless there is a unified agreement for paths forward. I guess it would be an expanded dog for JADC2. So this is a question, I think, that, you know, at the 60,000 foot view, there's a lot of moving parts. We're talking about aircraft systems. You just addressed, you know, pulling a card out for a comm system, putting another one in. There are a lot of activities. We have the Air Force Futures, formerly AFWIC, that is looking at our warfighting integrated capabilities. And so while this isn't necessarily focused on systems within a system or subsystems within a system, it is relevant in terms of how we fight. Would Mark or Sean, would you, either of you, like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. I mean, obviously, in industry, we're not too involved in day-to-day things going on at the joint staff level, but there are some things that I see, at least, that I think are encouraging in this realm. You know, so the agreement that was signed, you know, between our Air Force chief and the chief of the Army about 6 months ago with relation to cooperation on JADC2 and potentially them being involved in some degree in what ABMS will ultimately look like. I think that's a good positive indicator of that happening in the joint environment. You know, and there are going to be more and more things, aircraft and systems and pieces and parts that are all designed for this JADC2 construct, and we have to be able to use them across service boundaries. So you know, and we have to be able to think about that in a way that does not cause us to wrap our arms around it and say, well, that's mine because I invented it. We have to be willing to share, and I see good indications of that. You know, that Army Air Force connection I mentioned. The Army has been knee deep in fielding the next generation of future helicopters that they call future vertical lift, and seeing the pockets of the Air Force that fly helicopters also latching onto that and starting to pay attention to what the Army is doing and recognizing that they will ultimately be beneficiaries of the work that they're doing. I think that suggests that that is the inter-service sharing of information is happening. And maybe it's not something we always see at the working level, but I think it's going to become more prevalent, if for no other reason, just because of the types of solutions that we're going to be moving to in the next few years and how critical they're going to be.
And I think that the person who asked the individual who asked the question was spot on from a .MLPF strategy. I mean, you have to look at doctrine, you have to look at, you know, training and organization and you know, how we approach that. But I do, you know, from what I've learned after being at the Pentagon and you know, working now in AFL-CMC, the how we are through ABMS and JADC2 really building that infrastructure, that future for a more purple use. I have another question. This one is based on the human-machine interface discussion. Do you see a movement to more immersive technologies, AR, VR, to maximize understanding of the environment for remotely piloted aircraft, battle management functions, and operational strategic C2? Who wants to take a virtual reality question? How about Sean?
Yeah, I'll jump in this one. And the answer is absolutely yes. I inferred it a little bit earlier when I talked about operators who may be thousands of miles away from the machine. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we have a lot of senses, right? We have the visual, you know, senses, but, you know, how do you go ahead and create that immersive environment? And virtual reality is all around us. I mean, literally all around us, you know, kids chasing Neopets. I don't know if that happens anymore or not. That was like a 2018 thing, I guess, right? Or maybe 2017. But yeah, absolutely. And this ties back to that human-machine interface or man-machine interface that I was talking about earlier. Absolutely. We have to be able to create the sense of an individual, you know, being there with their system, even if they're not. To have the actual feel of the system when they're far away, and have the tactile, the sensory, all put them there. So yeah, I think that's a big part of this. And this also means that there's I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but AI is going to be a great tool for also people using our AI systems are going to make our AI even smarter, even better. And so using AI for training and such is going to be, it's going to be a two-way journey of helping the operator, but also making the AI better across hundreds and hundreds of pilots and operators. So there's a lot going on here, and it's actually really exciting. And I just hope I live long enough to be able to figure out how to play it like my kids are able to with, the various games they play. But absolutely, this is where things are going, and this is how I see us, positioning ourselves at Elbit, is to create those immersive environments for people in the cockpit and for folks that aren't.
Okay, great response. Mark, any thoughts additional?
Yeah, I would say that there is definitely an increased need for that, and I think that in the coming years you will see a more perhaps a faster adoption of VR and AR. As Sean mentioned, our collaboration between our two companies in the helmet mounted display area, and I think that's a technology that's just ripe for this kind of thing. We've always talked about the need for perhaps the need for the pilot of a remotely piloted aircraft to have some sort of a helmet type device. I mean, now obviously they're not going to wear the same helmet that a pilot of an F-35 wears because they don't have to eject from the control box, but perhaps a head-worn device that's going to allow them to have the same type of situational awareness that a pilot flying a real aircraft might have. And then I think that especially translates into the training environment, as Sean said. There are some really exciting things happening in test training and range instrumentation. I know within our company we have, the ability to do live virtual constructive training, for example, where you can have a pilot in a simulator flying against or as a wingman with a real aircraft that's flying in the sky, and then giving both of them the physical and virtual cues to be able to interpret and react to what the other aircraft is doing. So I think that all fits together in this construct, and yes, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We're going to see a lot more.
Okay, great. Thanks for bringing in that LVC element. I wasn't really thinking about that, but that is a great use of virtual reality or that kind of thing. So we are running out of time. And so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank both Mr. Marc Ayala and Mr. Sean Bond. So Marc is representing Collins Aerospace in this session, and Mr. Bond is representing Elbit Systems of America. So with that, I want to thank both of you for your input and your insight in today's session. And I'd like to thank everyone who participated and provided some great questions. There's also some information in chat I encourage you folks to follow up with. I thought it was some very insightful comments that will help you to grow and learn in this area as and any kind of application. So with that, I want to thank you all and encourage you to attend some other sessions today. So thanks again. I'm out.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you.